The world had already been teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. A series of strange events, ranging from unexplained disappearances to aggressive outbursts from those normally mild-mannered, had already sparked whispers of something dark on the horizon. But no one, not even the brightest scientists or military leaders, could have predicted what came next. In the quiet suburban town of Clearwater, life had been relatively normal until that fateful morning when everything started to fall apart. Dr. Lena Hill had been working in her lab at the Clearwater Research Institute when she received the call. The voice on the other end was trembling, barely holding together as it reported a strange incident at a nearby hospital. Initially dismissing it as an isolated case of rabies or some other rare disease, Lena was hesitant to engage. But the urgency in the doctor's voice struck a chord in her. She knew something wasn't right. By the time Lena arrived at the hospital, the chaos was already underway. The lobby was filled with frightened patients and panicked staff, some of whom were visibly shaken. But it wasn't the medical emergency that caught her attention, it was the violence that was taking place. A man, seemingly in his 30s, was attacking a nurse in the hallway, his teeth sinking into her arm with an unnatural ferocity. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the signs immediately: the unblinking eyes, the sickly pallor, the jerky, inhuman movements. This wasn't just a disease, it was something far worse. She had read the papers, heard rumors of outbreaks across the globe, but this was different. The man wasn't just ill, he was transforming. In a haze of fear and adrenaline, Lena sprinted to the nurse's aid, grabbing the nearest object, a metal tray, and using it to push the man off her. The nurse, bloodied and barely conscious, collapsed to the floor as Lena staggered back. The man, if he could still be called that, continued to snap and claw, his once human features now twisted into something unrecognizable. "Stay back. We need to lock this place down," the head doctor screamed, coming around the corner with a few security guards in tow. The guards, armed with nothing but basic handguns, attempted to subdue the violent patient. But they were ill-prepared for what they were dealing with. The man, his once delicate features now grotesque, snapped the guard's wrist with a single violent twist before sinking his teeth into the man's throat. A horrifying scream echoed through the hospital, and the infection spread like wildfire. Lena could feel her body trembling as panic took root, but she didn't have time to process her fear. The nurse, now barely conscious, whispered hoarsely, "It's everywhere. It's happening to everyone." The blood on her uniform was staining her clothes, but the terror in her eyes was what stuck with Lena. "What's happening?" Lena asked, trying to steady her breathing, her mind racing to make sense of the chaos erupting around her. I don't know. People, they're turning. They're turning into monsters. I saw it in the emergency room. Just run. Save yourself." Before Lena could react, she heard the unmistakable sound of growls and snarls echoing through the hallways. A sickening wave of realization hit her: this was no isolated incident. The outbreak was spreading. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her brother, Mark. It simply read, "Lena, don't come home. Something's happening." Terror gripped her chest. Mark lived only a few miles away, but his message made her hesitate. She couldn't just leave him. As she made her way toward the exit, she could hear the sound of footsteps, too many to count, closing in on her. She had to move faster. Outside, the world had already begun to change. The streets were empty, the air was thick with tension, and distant sirens echoed in every direction. Lena could hear cries for help and the unmistakable sounds of violence in the distance. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as she raced toward her brother's house. She couldn't stop now. Her only thought was to get to him, to get to safety, but deep down, she knew the world was no longer the place it once was. The infection was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined, and the world was changing with every passing second. As Lena sprinted through the quiet streets, she could already see the signs of the inevitable. People were emerging from buildings, their movements erratic, their eyes vacant. The people she once knew, neighbors, friends, strangers, had already become something else. Something terrifying. she finally arrived at her brother's house, gasping for breath. She pounded on the door, heart racing. "Mark," she yelled. "Mark, it's me. Open up." The door swung open to reveal her brother, wide-eyed and breathing heavily. Behind him, the living room was dark, save for a single lamp that flickered dimly. She could see that he was pale, a bead of sweat dripping down his forehead. "Lena, you shouldn't be here," he said, his voice strained, his eyes filled with fear. "Mark, what's going on? What's happening?" she demanded, fear clawing at her throat. Mark didn't answer right away. He just stared at her, his gaze haunted, before finally whispering, "The world is changing. And we need to survive." The sound of a distant roar echoed through the air. And then the unmistakable growl of something far worse than human. Lena turned to face the door, her heart pounding as the first zombie clawed its way into view. This was only the beginning. The door slammed shut just in time to block the first undead creature from entering. The creature, once a human, thrashed violently against the door, its growls deafening. Lena and Mark stood frozen for a heartbeat, staring at the grotesque figure, its yellowed eyes wide with malice. Mark's face had drained of color, and Lena could see the panic clawing at the edges of his usually calm demeanor. "Is that—" Lena couldn't finish the sentence, her throat dry. "It's happening everywhere," Mark whispered, his voice tight with dread. "I don't know how much longer we can hold out." His eyes darted to the windows, where shadows were beginning to creep around the edges, the groans and growls of the infected rising from every direction. "We need to figure out a plan. Fast." Lena's mind raced. She had been in the hospital just hours ago, and now it was here. It had come to their doorstep. Mark's grip tightened on the door as the creature outside banged its fists against it, a horrible rhythm of fury. Lena instinctively grabbed a nearby chair, dragging it over to block the door further. "What happened? How did this all start?" Lena asked, trying to stay calm, but her voice trembled in spite of her best efforts. "I don't know," Mark replied, swallowing hard. "I thought it was just the flu at first. People were getting sick, but then people started dying. Only they didn't stay dead. They came back." His eyes seemed to gloss over, reliving the horror in his mind. "I was at work when it happened. I barely made it back home before everything fell apart." Lena took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. "What about Mom and Dad? Are they okay?" Mark shook his head, his face a mask of guilt. "I don't know. I haven't been able to reach them. I tried calling, but the lines are down." Lena's heart sank, a familiar pain clawing at her chest. Their parents had lived across town, just far enough away to make travel impossible now. The world had broken in ways that couldn't be fixed, and all they could do now was survive. The infected outside the door were growing more aggressive. The first one, the one who had been beating on the door, was joined by others. Their movements were erratic, mindless, but powerful. The sound of glass shattering came from a nearby window, followed by a blood-curdling screech. One of the infected had found its way inside. Lena grabbed her brother's arm, her pulse quickening. "We need to move. They'll get in soon." Mark nodded, his expression hardening. "I know a place, there's a safe house in the city. We can get there. If we hurry." Lena didn't hesitate. They couldn't afford to stay. Not when more and more of the infected were swarming the streets. As she turned toward the front door, she caught a glimpse of the small kitchen behind them, a faint glimmer of something useful. "Wait," she said, rushing to grab a few kitchen knives and a couple of cans of food. She shoved them into her backpack, ready for whatever came next. Mark moved to grab a bat from the corner, the makeshift weapon likely his last line of defense. Together, they backed toward the door. Mark peered through the peephole cautiously before turning to Lena. "It's clear for now. We need to make it to the back alley. There's a car parked there, but we have to hurry." Lena nodded, gripping her brother's arm tightly as they made their way out the door. The air outside was thick with the smell of smoke and decay, and the sound of distant wails sent shivers down her spine. It was as if the world was collapsing in real time, everything they once knew slipping through their fingers. The alley was eerily quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of movement. Mark's car was parked just ahead, the engine still cold, its windows half shattered. As they neared it, a shrill cry came from behind them. Lena spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A group of the infected had appeared from nowhere, shambling toward them with horrific speed. Their eyes were vacant, their flesh decayed, but their hunger was unmistakable. They were closing in fast. "Mark, we need to go, now!" Lena screamed. Mark didn't hesitate. He shoved open the car door, motioning for Lena to get inside. But just as she reached for the handle, a screeching figure lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a strength that was unnatural. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the creature's teeth came dangerously close to her neck. "No!" Mark shouted, pulling out the bat and slamming it into the creature's head. The force was enough to knock the infected back, but not enough to stop it completely. With a desperate grunt, Lena yanked herself free, stumbling back toward the car. Mark grabbed her by the arm, pulling her inside and slamming the door shut behind them. The engine roared to life, and Mark threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as they sped out of the alley. Behind them, the infected followed, shambling and staggering after their prey, but it was clear that Lena and Mark had bought themselves some time. As they sped through the city, Lena glanced at the rearview mirror. More of the infected were emerging from buildings, flooding the streets like a tidal wave. The world outside the car was descending into an apocalyptic nightmare. They weren't safe. Not yet. But one thing was certain, they were going to have to fight, every step of the way, if they were going to survive this new world. Lena's hands clenched the edge of her seat as Mark swerved the car through the city streets, narrowly avoiding abandoned vehicles and the growing swarm of the infected. The sky above was a dull gray, heavy clouds hanging low as though the heavens themselves were mourning the destruction unfolding below. "Mark, how much farther?" Lena's voice was strained, a mix of fear and exhaustion creeping into her tone. "I think, just a few more blocks. We're almost there." Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white as he navigated the desolate streets with caution. His face was pale, his eyes darting from the rearview mirror to the side windows, alert for any signs of movement. The city had descended into chaos. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the streets, doors left open in a frantic attempt to escape the nightmare that had overtaken the world. Distant screams echoed through the buildings, a haunting reminder of what was happening to the people still trapped in the madness. But Mark wasn't thinking about them, not anymore. His focus was solely on getting Lena and himself to the safe house, the one place he hoped could provide some semblance of security. As they turned a corner, a decrepit building loomed in the distance, its windows shattered, but its structure intact. The safe house was nestled in a residential area on the outskirts of the city, and Mark had kept the location a secret, hoping it would remain undisturbed. But in a world like this, secrets had a way of being exposed. Lena spotted the familiar rusted gate as they pulled up to the house, and her heart skipped a beat. "Is this it?" she asked, barely believing it could be true. "Yeah," Mark replied, his voice clipped. He quickly shut off the engine and threw open the door, motioning for Lena to follow him. They couldn't afford to waste time. The infection was spreading too quickly, and every second counted. They hurried through the narrow yard, pushing past overgrown shrubs and broken fences. The house was old, but sturdy, with heavy steel shutters covering the windows, a precaution Mark had put in place long before the world had begun to fall apart. Lena's pulse raced as they reached the front door, but Mark paused. His eyes scanned the area warily, and he held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. "Something's off," Mark muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She followed Mark's gaze, but the yard was empty, save for the remnants of an overturned trash can and scattered debris. The neighborhood around them was silent, eerily so, but she could feel the tension in the air. Something wasn't right. Mark's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for Lena to stay behind him. With slow, deliberate steps, he approached the door, checking the lock before entering the code that would open the heavy metal gate. The sound of the gate's mechanism unlocking echoed through the yard, and Mark quickly shoved it open, ushering Lena inside. They stepped into the dimly lit hallway of the safe house, the heavy metal door shutting behind them with a loud clang. Lena took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The interior of the house was cold, the walls lined with shelves of canned food, medical supplies, and makeshift weapons, everything they'd need to survive for a while. "Do you think we're safe here?" Lena asked, her voice laced with uncertainty as she took in the fortified interior. "I don't know," Mark admitted, the strain in his voice evident. "We can stay here for a while, but I'm not sure how long it'll hold. There's too much going on out there. Too many infected." Lena nodded grimly, her gaze lingering on the map pinned to the wall, a map of the city, with marked locations of known safe zones. Most of the safe zones were crossed out with thick black lines. It was a reminder of how quickly things had gone from bad to worse. A loud bang sounded from outside, followed by a series of high-pitched, guttural cries. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward Mark, her eyes wide with fear. "They're here," she whispered. Mark's face hardened. "Stay here," he ordered, his tone unwavering. He grabbed a crowbar from a nearby shelf and moved toward the front door. "I'll check the perimeter. If it's just a few, we'll take care of it. But if they've found us," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Lena watched him leave, her heart hammering in her chest. The weight of the world seemed to press down on her as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. She stood there, torn between a desire to run and the need to stay put and wait for Mark to return. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to get out, to find safety somewhere, anywhere, but the safe house was the best option they had. And Mark was right. If the infected found them here, they'd be trapped. It was only a matter of time. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Lena's breath caught as she turned toward the door. Mark stepped back inside, his face pale and his eyes wide with alarm. "We've got company," he said, his voice strained. "There's a group of them coming down the street. We don't have much time." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "How many?" "At least a dozen," Mark replied, his expression grim. "Maybe more." Without another word, they moved to the back of the house, where a trapdoor led to a basement. The house was well stocked with supplies, but it also had hidden exits and escape routes in case things went south. The basement was their last line of defense. "Get downstairs." "I'll keep watch from here," Mark ordered. Lena hesitated, but only for a moment. She knew that staying upstairs wasn't an option. She grabbed her backpack and descended into the dimly lit basement, the air thick with the musty scent of old storage. The basement was sparse but secure, a small room with a few mattresses, some crates of food, and a few old blankets. She dropped her bag onto one of the mattresses, her mind racing as the distant sounds of the infected grew louder. The world outside was falling apart, but she couldn't afford to lose hope. Not yet. As she huddled in the basement, Lena couldn't help but wonder how long they would be able to hold out in this small, hidden refuge. The infected were everywhere, and they weren't going to stop until they had claimed every living soul in their path. But Lena was determined to survive. She wasn't going to let them take everything. Not without a fight. Lena sat in the basement, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. The sounds of the infected outside grew louder, punctuated by distant screams and the maddening growls of the mindless creatures. Her ears rang with the tension of knowing that at any moment, the house could be overrun, and the fragile safety they had found would crumble. Mark had been pacing the small upstairs room for what felt like hours, watching the street and ensuring they were still hidden. The trapdoor to the basement was their only means of escape, but Lena knew it wasn't much of an option if things went wrong. It was a small, confined space with no real way out unless they wanted to take the risk of moving through the infected streets. She gripped the edge of her backpack, her thoughts racing. They'd been in the house for a few hours now, but time was slipping away. The longer they stayed here, the more likely it was that the infected would find them. Every creak of the old house felt like a threat, every crackle of movement outside, a harbinger of doom. Mark's voice echoed from above. Lena. Lena shot to her feet, her heart leaping in her chest. What's wrong? She called out, her mind already thinking the worst. Get up here, quick. Mark's voice was tight, full of urgency. She wasted no time, scrambling up the wooden stairs and pushing open the trapdoor. Her heart was racing as she emerged into the kitchen, her gaze meeting Mark's wide-eyed stare. There at the door, he whispered urgently. They know we're here. Lena's stomach dropped. How? I don't know. Mark's voice was shaky, his face pale. He reached for his bat and glanced at the boarded-up windows. I was keeping watch, and then I saw them. A group, too many to count, shuffling down the street. At first, I thought they might just pass by, but no. They've started to circle the house. They're testing the doors and windows. Lena's heart hammered in her chest. She turned toward the back of the house where the garage door had been hastily reinforced with metal sheets. If the infected got inside, they'd be trapped with no way to escape. We can't stay here, Lena said, her voice low but firm. If they break in, it's over. We need to move. Mark nodded, his expression grim. I know, but where do we go? I thought the safe house would hold longer than this. There's a warehouse a few miles north, Lena said, her mind flashing back to the city map they'd seen earlier. It's one of the last known safe zones. There might still be people there. It's our best shot. Mark hesitated. It's a risk, Lena. The roads are a nightmare, and we don't know what we'll find. But it's better than staying here, waiting to be overrun. Lena's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. We can't afford to wait any longer. If we stay, they'll get in. We have to go now. Mark looked out the window once more, his eyes scanning the growing mass of infected outside. It wasn't just a few stragglers anymore, it was a full-blown horde. There were dozens of them now, stumbling over debris, their groans filling the air like a chorus of doom. All right, we move in 5 minutes. Get what you can. We need to be quick. Lena didn't hesitate. She turned and rushed back to the basement, grabbing her backpack and stuffing it with whatever supplies she could find, more canned food, a flashlight, a first aid kit. She grabbed a couple of knives from the kitchen, knowing they wouldn't be able to rely on anything more than close-quarters weapons for the foreseeable future. As she moved back upstairs, she saw Mark securing the door with whatever they could find. His face was tight with concentration, and there was no trace of hesitation in his movements. They both knew the risk. They were about to leave the relative safety of the house and head straight into the unknown. Mark turned to Lena, his eyes dark with determination. We move fast, stay low, and stick to the side streets. Don't draw attention. Got it? Got it, Lena replied, her throat tight with anxiety. The plan was simple, move as quietly as possible, avoid the horde at all costs, and get to the warehouse before nightfall. But with the infected swarming the area, nothing was ever simple anymore. They slipped out of the house and into the backyard, crouching low to avoid being seen. The street was a mess, cars abandoned, debris scattered everywhere, and the streets eerily quiet aside from the occasional groan from the infected. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the sound of distant sirens and chaos still hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Mark held up his hand, signaling for Lena to stop. Up ahead, a group of infected was wandering aimlessly in the street. Their bodies were grotesque, decomposing and mangled. Some of them wore remnants of old clothes, others were just patches of skin and bone, dragging their feet across the pavement with disturbing persistence. Lena's breath caught in her throat as Mark motioned for her to move to the left, toward an alley that would lead them further into the city. It was tight, claustrophobic, and likely to be filled with more dangers, but it was their only way forward. They made their way through the alley, staying as close to the walls as possible, each step measured and silent. Lena's pulse raced as they passed through the darkness, her body trembling with every footstep. She could hear the infected just ahead, their dragging footsteps and guttural noises echoing off the brick walls. A sudden crash rang out in the alleyway ahead. Mark's eyes shot to the source of the noise, and Lena's heart skipped a beat. A few infected had stumbled into the alley, their faces twisted in a grotesque grimace as they stumbled toward them. Without thinking, Mark shoved her back against the wall, pulling the bat from his belt and swinging it with all his strength. The bat connected with one of the infected's skull, sending the creature crumpling to the ground. But the others kept coming. They weren't stopping. And they were getting closer. "Lena, run!" Mark shouted. Lena didn't hesitate. She sprinted forward, her breath ragged, her mind racing. As she glanced back, she saw Mark battling the oncoming wave of infected, swinging his bat with brutal precision. But there were too many of them. Lena's legs burned as she pushed herself harder, her only focus on getting to the warehouse, to survival. She didn't know if Mark would make it, but she had to keep moving. There was no other choice. She glanced around, searching for any sign of an escape route, and saw a familiar figure up ahead. She could only hope she was not too late to save the last shred of hope they had left. Lena's breath came in sharp gasps as she raced through the alley, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the frantic thumping of her feet against the pavement, but more disturbingly, she could also hear the growls of the infected growing closer, their ravenous pursuit just a few steps behind her. The alley seemed to stretch forever, the dim light from the fading sun casting long shadows that twisted and stretched unnaturally. Her mind raced as she tried to push forward, but every step felt heavier, as if the weight of the world was pulling her down. She glanced back once more, her stomach sinking as she saw the infected pouring into the alley, their pale, decaying faces locked in an eternal grimace. Mark was still behind her, fighting off the relentless onslaught. She could see him swinging the bat with all his might, his movements frantic but precise. Each strike knocked another infected to the ground, but there were too many for him to handle alone. Lena's chest tightened with fear and guilt. She wanted to go back. She wanted to help him, but she couldn't afford to waste any more time. If she didn't keep moving, the horde would swallow them both. She had to make it to the warehouse. It was their only chance. With one last look at Mark, Lena turned the corner, ducking into a narrow side street. She didn't know where she was going, but the sound of the infected getting closer urged her on. The street ahead was more open, and the light from the setting sun illuminated her path. She sprinted past abandoned cars, their windows shattered, and empty storefronts, trying to push the fear and doubt out of her mind. Her mind kept replaying the images of Mark, fighting for their survival, and the thought that she might be leaving him behind gnawed at her with every step. But then she saw it. In the distance, through the haze of smoke and decay, she spotted the silhouette of a large warehouse at the end of the street. It was still standing, though it was battered by time and neglect. The large metal doors were barely hanging on their hinges, but the structure was intact. Lena pushed herself harder, ignoring the sharp burn in her legs, her lungs screaming for air. She couldn't slow down now, not when they were so close. She reached the entrance, stumbling as she yanked open the half-ajar door. The smell of old metal, dust, and decay filled her nostrils as she stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim, industrial lighting. Her breath caught in her throat. The place was deserted. Empty crates and broken shelves were scattered throughout the warehouse, but there was no sign of life. No survivors. The quiet was deafening, and Lena's heart sank. She had been hoping for refuge, a safe place, but instead, she was met with more silence. Her head spun as she leaned against the metal door, trying to steady herself. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder, and she knew the infected were closing in. She couldn't wait here for long. With no other options, Lena hurried deeper into the warehouse, searching for anything that could give her a hint of safety. There was a staircase at the far end, leading up to a loft area where the faint light of a broken window flickered. It was higher ground. If she could get up there, she might be able to get a better view of the street and perhaps spot a way out. She ascended the stairs quickly, the metal steps creaking under her weight, and made her way to the loft. She peered out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. The street below was eerily quiet for a moment, but the horde was still out there. They were closing in on the warehouse. "Please, Mark," Lena whispered to herself. She wanted him to be here. She wanted to see him safe, but there was no time to wait. She had to find a way to survive on her own, for now. Her eyes scanned the horizon, looking for a way to escape, but there was no clear path. The streets were swarming with infected, and the city was crumbling all around her. Then, as she turned to survey the rest of the warehouse, something caught her eye, a faint glow emanating from the far corner. She blinked, unsure if it was just her eyes playing tricks on her in the dim light. But the glow was real. Lena cautiously approached, her footsteps light, each one echoing in the empty space. As she got closer, she realized the source of the light was coming from a generator, a large, industrial one sitting in the corner, connected to a few makeshift wires and a series of old batteries. It looked like someone had been using it to keep the place running, maybe as a backup power source. Her heart skipped a beat. If she could get the generator going, it could power up the lights, or even, just maybe, alert any survivors nearby. But the closer she got, the more she noticed the odd details about the warehouse. The scattered food cans and medical supplies, the remnants of furniture, and the strange markings on the walls. This place wasn't as empty as it first appeared. Lena's instincts screamed at her to turn back, to leave the generator alone and hide, but curiosity, and desperation, compelled her forward. She knelt by the generator, dusting off the grime to get a better look at it. There was a large switch on the side, and when she flicked it, the hum of the machine came to life, its engine sputtering but slowly picking up speed. The warehouse lit up, the overhead lights flickering to life in a slow, steady pulse. For a moment, everything was calm, almost normal, but Lena's gut told her something wasn't right. Then she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not the slow, dragging shuffle of the infected. These were deliberate, purposeful steps. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. Someone else was here. She backed away from the generator, her body tensing with a new kind of fear. Was it another survivor? Or worse, was it someone who had already been turned? The footsteps grew louder, closer, until... Lena? Her name. Lena's eyes widened, her heart leaping in her chest as she turned toward the sound of the voice. There, standing in the doorway of the loft, was Mark. He was covered in blood and grime, his clothes torn, but alive. He was breathing heavily, clearly exhausted, but he was here. You made it. Lena's voice was barely a whisper, her emotions a whirlwind as she rushed to him. Mark gave her a tight, exhausted smile. I told you I would. Lena didn't waste another second. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the generator. We need to hide. They're coming. The sound of the horde outside was growing louder, but now, for the first time in hours, Lena felt a spark of hope. Together, they might just have a chance. But they had to survive long enough to find it. Lena and Mark stood in the dimly lit loft of the warehouse, their breath coming in labored gasps as they took a moment to catch their bearings. Mark was covered in grime and dried blood, his clothes torn in several places, but there was a fire in his eyes that gave Lena hope. Against all odds, he had made it. She hadn't realized how much she needed that reassurance until she saw him standing there, alive. Mark glanced around the loft, taking in the scattered supplies and the hum of the generator. This place, it's not what I thought it was. It feels like someone's been living here. Lena nodded, her eyes scanning the space with unease. It's strange, I know. It doesn't look like a typical abandoned building. But we don't have much time to figure it out. The infected will be here soon. Mark was already moving toward the edge of the loft, peering out through the broken window to the street below. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the abandoned city. The streets are full of them. We can't stay here forever. We won't, Lena said firmly. But we have to regroup first. We need to figure out our next move. We've been running on empty for too long. Mark didn't argue. Instead, he sat down on a stack of crates, his hands resting on his knees as he exhaled deeply. Lena could see the exhaustion in his face, the weariness that came from surviving in a world gone mad. It had been days since either of them had a real chance to rest, and the constant strain was beginning to take its toll. "We need a plan," Mark said quietly. "We can't keep running like this. We need to find a way to fight back." Lena thought about that for a moment. Her mind raced through the options. They could try to make it to the northern safe zone, but that was over 100 miles away and the roads were filled with dangers. They could try to scavenge supplies from the city, but that would mean getting close to the infected, too close. Their best bet was to wait until morning, when the infected's movement might slow, and then reassess their options. "We'll wait here for the night," Lena said, her voice firm. "The warehouse might be empty now, but if we can hold out for a few hours, we can make a plan. We've got enough food and water to last us, and we have the generator going. If we can rest, we'll be in better shape to think clearly." Mark nodded, though his expression remained grim. He didn't say it aloud, but Lena could see the doubt in his eyes. What if they were just delaying the inevitable? What if the infected found their way in before morning? Lena forced herself to push those thoughts aside. Worrying wouldn't help them survive. For now, they needed to stay hidden. The next few hours passed in tense silence. Mark continued to watch the streets through the window, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Lena busied herself with securing the warehouse, stacking crates against the doors, checking for any other possible entry points, and making sure the generator would keep running through the night. As the light from the fading sun slowly disappeared, the warehouse grew darker, the flickering overhead lights casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch out across the room like long fingers. Despite the calm, Lena could feel the heaviness in the air, the weight of the world outside, pushing against the fragile walls that separated them from the chaos. It wasn't until the moon was high in the sky that Lena felt the first true sense of calm. They had made it through the worst of the day. The infected had slowed their movements as night fell, and the streets outside were eerily quiet. Mark had fallen into an exhausted sleep on the stack of crates, his face relaxed for the first time in days. Lena sat on the floor beside him, her back resting against one of the walls, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She longed for sleep, but she couldn't afford to rest for long. Not when there was still so much at stake. She pulled the map from her backpack and spread it out in front of her, studying the marked safe zones. Her finger traced the route to the northern outpost, the path they had hoped to take. But now, with the infected closing in and the city rapidly falling apart, she wasn't sure it was still an option. She scanned the map again, trying to find a new route, but the lines all seemed to lead to dead ends. The infected had spread everywhere. There was no place safe anymore. Her fingers paused on the map, landing on a small, unmarked area near the outskirts of the city. It was a hospital, one that had been repurposed into a quarantine zone. The symbol on the map indicated it was still standing, but it had been isolated from the main city for weeks. It might be their best shot at finding other survivors and gaining more supplies. Lena studied the distance between the warehouse and the hospital. It was risky, but it could be worth it. They needed to make a decision soon, though, before the infected returned in full force. She turned her gaze to Mark, who was still sleeping soundly, his breathing steady. For a moment, she let herself relax, letting the weight of the day slide off her shoulders. It was tempting to let her guard down, to simply rest and pretend everything would be okay. But the reality of their situation quickly snapped her back into focus. The world outside was still crumbling. They couldn't afford to relax, not for a second. As she prepared to wake Mark, her eyes flicked toward the corner of the loft. Something was different. The shadows in the corner seemed deeper than they had before. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she slowly stood up, her senses alert. The quiet hum of the generator filled the space, but there was something else, a soft sound, faint but unmistakable. A faint rustling noise. It was coming from the far corner, near the metal door. She moved quietly, her footsteps almost silent as she crept toward the source of the sound. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift again, and her breath caught in her throat. Someone was in the warehouse. Her mind raced as she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't be sure who, or what, was hiding in the corner. But she had to find out before it found them first. With one last glance at Mark, Lena silently approached the corner, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea who, or what, she was about to face. But she knew that whatever it was about to change everything. Lena crept closer to the corner of the warehouse, her pulse quickening with every step. The rustling sound grew louder, almost deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was hiding there was fully aware of her presence. Her hand instinctively reached for one of the knives she had tucked in her belt. The metal handle felt reassuring against her palm, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She paused just before the corner, her breath shallow, her muscles tensed and ready to spring into action. There were too many questions, and not enough answers. Who else could be in the warehouse? A survivor? A threat? One thing was certain, she couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The noise stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. It felt as though time itself had frozen, the air thick with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Lena's eyes darted around the dimly lit room, the shadows twisting and moving in strange ways. Then, just as she was about to take another step, the rustling returned, louder now, accompanied by a low, strained groan. Lena's heart skipped a beat. That wasn't the sound of a human. It was something else, something wrong. Without thinking, she rounded the corner, knife raised, ready to defend herself. What she saw made her blood run cold. A man, disheveled and covered in dirt and blood, was crouched in the corner, his back pressed against the wall. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, and his eyes were wide and glazed with fear. The moment she locked eyes with him, he froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a split second, Lena thought he was another survivor, but then she saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't just afraid. He was desperate. And the bloodstains on his clothes didn't look like they came from any injury he might have sustained. Lena stepped back, her instincts screaming at her to stay alert. The man didn't move, didn't even blink, as he slowly shifted his weight toward her. It was as if he was testing her reaction. "What do you want?" Lena's voice was cold and firm, despite the pounding of her heart. "Who are you?" The man's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. He swallowed hard, his face twitching in pain as if the very act of speaking caused him physical distress. I didn't mean to scare you," he whispered, his voice raspy and faint. "I thought you were one of them." Lena kept the knife pointed at him, wary but unwilling to strike just yet. There was something about the man's demeanor that didn't fit the typical profile of an infected. His movements were too controlled, too human, despite the wildness in his eyes. "Who are you?" she asked again, her grip tightening on the handle. I'm not one of them," the man said, his voice shaking. "Please, you have to believe me." Lena could hear the desperation in his voice, but her instincts still urged caution. The infected weren't always easy to spot. They didn't always show signs right away. But something about this man's presence, his struggle to speak, made her hesitate. "How long have you been here?" Lena pressed. "And how did you get inside?" The man flinched at the question, his eyes darting around nervously, as though he were trying to process the best response. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "I've been here for days. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I thought this place was safe. At first, I thought I could hide out. But, the noise, the things outside, they're getting worse. I can't leave." Lena frowned, her mind racing. He didn't seem like he was lying, but the circumstances were odd. Why hadn't he moved to find other survivors? Why hadn't he tried to make contact with anyone? "And you're sure you're not infected?" Lena asked, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. She didn't want to ask, didn't want to think about it, but it was the only question that mattered. The man looked at her, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm not one of them. Please." He leaned forward slightly, as though pleading for her belief. "I don't want to hurt you. I just need help." Lena's heart tightened, a swell of sympathy threatening to break through her wall of caution. She could see the raw fear in his eyes, and for a brief moment, she wondered if he was telling the truth. "Where are you from?" she asked, her voice softening, though she remained on edge. I was with a group of survivors." The man's voice faltered. "But, they didn't make it. They were taken by the infected." Lena's eyes narrowed, her mind piecing together the fragments of his story. If he'd been hiding out for days, why hadn't he left before? And why was he still here, waiting, when the threat was closing in on all sides? "What happened?" she asked, her suspicion growing. The man swallowed, his eyes flicking toward the door. "I heard them coming. I couldn't escape. I hid here, hoping they wouldn't find me. The infected, they're everywhere. I'm not like them. I swear." Lena studied his face carefully, weighing her options. She knew she couldn't afford to take unnecessary risks, but something in the man's eyes told her he wasn't a threat. Not yet, at least. "All right," she said finally, lowering the knife slightly but not entirely letting her guard down. "You're coming with me. But if I find out you're hiding something, or if you turn," her voice was steady, though her warning was clear, "I'll leave you behind without a second thought." The man nodded quickly, his face pale with relief. "I understand. Thank you. You don't know how much this means." Lena hesitated for a moment longer, watching him carefully. She wasn't sure what to make of him yet, but there was no time to question everything. They had to stick together if they were going to survive the night. She glanced over her shoulder at Mark, who was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the new arrival. "We need to wake him," Lena said quietly, her voice firm as she turned back to the man. "You stay here. Don't move until we've got a plan." The man nodded in agreement, and Lena moved toward Mark, her mind buzzing with new questions and new risks. She didn't trust the stranger fully yet, but they were in this together now. She'd have to watch him closely, but for the moment, he was their best shot at surviving whatever came next. And as the sounds of the infected grew louder outside, Lena knew that the true danger was only just beginning. Lena gently shook Mark awake, her hands still trembling from the encounter with the stranger. Her eyes darted back to the man in the corner of the loft, who hadn't moved an inch. Mark's eyes slowly fluttered open, his gaze still hazy from sleep. "What's going on?" Mark mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Lena didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We've got company." Mark's eyes sharpened instantly, the lingering fatigue forgotten. He sat up, his movements slow but purposeful. "Is he?" His voice trailed off, uncertainty in his tone. Lena nodded. "I think he's human, but I'm not sure. I didn't want to take chances while you were asleep." Mark glanced over to the man, who was still sitting in the corner, his face a mix of fear and relief. He didn't look like a threat, but then again, neither did anyone else they had encountered before the outbreak had fully taken hold. "Are you sure?" Mark asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure of anything anymore," Lena replied, her voice tense. "But he says he's a survivor. I don't know if we can trust him, but we don't have a lot of options right now." Mark stood and stretched, his body stiff from sleeping on crates, but the motion seemed to ignite a sense of urgency in him. He stepped over to where the man sat, his posture cautious but not aggressive. The stranger hadn't moved, his eyes still locked on Lena and Mark. "What's your name?" Mark asked, his tone wary but not unfriendly. The man looked up, his gaze flickering between the two of them. He opened his mouth to speak, then paused, as if considering his response carefully. "Isaac. My name's Isaac." Lena took a step closer, her arms crossed. "Isaac. Why didn't you try to leave when the others were taken? You could have gotten out before the infected surrounded the city." Isaac shifted uncomfortably at the question, his hands gripping the edge of his tattered pants. I couldn't. I couldn't leave them behind. I thought I could help, but," his voice cracked slightly, and he looked away, unable to meet Lena's eyes. "By the time I realized it was too late, they were already gone." There was a brief silence. Isaac's words hung in the air, and Lena could see the pain in his eyes. It was the same pain they all carried, the guilt of surviving when those around them had perished. But she couldn't afford to sympathize with him too much. They were all just trying to survive, and survival didn't make room for weakness. "Okay," Mark said, breaking the silence. "So now what?" "We're all stuck in here until we figure out our next move." Isaac nodded solemnly. "I can't help you with that. I don't know what's out there. But I do know one thing, they're getting smarter." Lena frowned, confused. "What do you mean, smarter?" Isaac glanced nervously toward the window, as though expecting to see the infected staring in at him. "I've seen them change. They're learning. They're not just stumbling around aimlessly anymore. They're hunting." Lena's stomach churned. Hunting? She had known the infected had evolved, that they were becoming more dangerous, but this was something else. Mark took a step closer to Isaac, his eyes narrowing. "You've been watching them?" Isaac didn't flinch. "I've been hiding. I had no choice. When the infected first started swarming the city, they were like animals, mindless. But the longer they've been here, the more organized they've become. They're not just roaming the streets anymore. They're patrolling." Lena's blood ran cold as the gravity of Isaac's words settled in. The infected were becoming more tactical, learning to track and hunt their prey. That meant they couldn't just wait around for dawn. If Isaac was right, they were running out of time. The infected weren't mindless hordes anymore, they were a force to be reckoned with. Mark exhaled sharply. "So, what do you suggest we do about it?" Isaac's eyes flickered toward the warehouse door. "We need to leave. Staying here won't protect us for long. They'll eventually figure out where we are. We need to move. Now." Lena's mind raced. She had known they couldn't stay hidden forever, but now the urgency was greater than ever. If Isaac's warning was true, staying in the warehouse for the night was no longer an option. The infected would find them. They were already hunting. "Where do we go?" Lena asked, turning her attention back to the map she had been studying earlier. Isaac hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice low. "There's a medical facility about 2 miles from here. It's near the outskirts of the city, and it's where I came from before I got trapped here. If it's still standing, it could be our best shot at finding supplies, and other survivors." Lena stared at the map, her eyes locking onto the location Isaac had mentioned. It was a risk, but it was their only shot. The hospital could have supplies, medical equipment, and maybe even a chance to regroup with others. "We'll go in the morning," Lena said, making the decision. "It's too dangerous to leave now, but we'll make the move at first light." Mark looked at her with a mixture of concern and agreement. "We'll need to be careful. If Isaac's right about them hunting us, we can't afford to make mistakes." Lena nodded. "We don't have a choice. We leave at dawn." Isaac stood up, his legs shaky from days of hiding and exhaustion, but he was determined. "I'll be ready. You won't regret this." But Lena wasn't so sure. She couldn't afford to take unnecessary risks, but they had no other choice. The hospital was their best chance. The hours passed in tense silence as they all prepared for what lay ahead. Lena, Mark, and Isaac scavenged what little they could from the warehouse. The generator hummed quietly in the background, but the sound felt more like a ticking clock, counting down to when they would have to leave. As the night stretched on, the sounds of the infected outside grew louder, echoing through the quiet streets. Every groan, every scrape of the undead's feet against the pavement seemed to draw closer. Lena's thoughts raced. Was Isaac telling the truth? She wanted to believe him, but trust was a fragile thing in this new world. They had to move. And soon. The dawn would bring new dangers, new choices. But it would also bring hope, or so Lena told herself. Because if they didn't leave now, there would be no hope left. The first light of dawn crept slowly through the cracked windows of the warehouse, casting long, thin beams across the floor. The quiet was deceptive. Lena could feel the weight of the world pressing in from every direction. The night had been long, and every sound outside had kept them on edge, but now, As the first rays of morning illuminated the space, she knew it was time. "Ready?" Lena's voice was steady, though her insides were coiled tight with nerves. Mark looked at her, his eyes tired but resolute. "I guess we don't have much of a choice." Isaac, who had been pacing nervously in the corner, gave a slow nod, his face pale and strained but determined. "We leave now, or we don't leave at all. The infected are getting smarter. They'll know we're here sooner or later." Lena gave a final glance around the warehouse, checking that their supplies were packed and that the generator was off. It had been their lifeline, but now they had to move. Every second counted. They moved quickly, as quietly as possible, through the back exit. The streets outside the warehouse were eerily quiet. The world had changed so much in such a short amount of time. Where there had once been a bustling city, now there was only ruin and decay. Shattered glass, abandoned cars, and twisted metal littered the streets. The air smelled like dust and rot, and the buildings loomed above them like silent sentinels, as if watching their every move. Isaac took the lead, his steps cautious but sure. Lena and Mark followed closely, their senses heightened, ears straining for any sounds that might signal danger. The infected weren't far behind, she could feel it in the air. They had decided to take a back alley route, avoiding the main roads where the infected were more likely to gather. The alley was narrow and choked with debris, but it would give them the cover they needed. As they moved deeper into the shadows, Lena's mind raced. The hospital was only 2 miles away, but every step felt like an eternity. They passed through a broken gate and slipped into a residential area that had been untouched by the immediate chaos. But it didn't feel safe. Not anymore. Lena knew better than to think they were out of harm's way. The infected were everywhere, lurking in places they couldn't predict. Halfway through the neighborhood, Lena froze, her heart racing. She motioned for Mark and Isaac to stop. She had heard something, soft shuffling footsteps, the unmistakable sound of something dragging itself along the ground. Isaac's eyes widened, and he grabbed Lena's arm, his grip tight. "They're getting closer. We need to move, now." Lena nodded, her stomach twisting in knots. She didn't need any more warning. They moved quickly, pushing through the alleyway toward a row of abandoned houses. They had to get to the next block. The hospital was within reach, but the infected were closing in. Suddenly, the faintest sound, an eerie, high-pitched groan, cut through the silence. Then another. And another. It wasn't just one infected. It was a group. Mark's face tightened. "We need to move. They're here." Isaac swore under his breath, looking frantically for an escape route. "We can't outrun them through this neighborhood. There's a back gate ahead, but we'll have to fight our way through." Lena didn't hesitate. She unsheathed her knife, holding it firmly in her hand, ready for whatever came next. "We don't have a choice." The first infected came around the corner, its head jerking toward them with an unnatural, twitching motion. Its face was a grotesque mask of decay, its eyes glazed with that terrible, mindless hunger. It staggered toward them, dragging one leg behind it as it reached out with gnarled hands. Lena's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She had seen this before. She had fought through this horror before. Without a word, she charged forward, slamming the knife into the infected's skull with a quick, decisive motion. It collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud, its lifeless body crumpling in a heap. But there were more. So many more. The sound of more infected shuffling in the alley grew louder, and the three of them fell into a rhythm of survival. Mark swung a crowbar he had found earlier, smashing the skull of one of the creatures as it lunged toward him. Isaac, who was smaller and less experienced in combat, hesitated at first but then found his footing, using a broken pipe to keep the infected at bay. Lena fought with everything she had. She moved swiftly, cutting through the crowd of infected as they tried to surround them. Every time one of them fell, another seemed to take its place. It was a never-ending tide of hunger and death. "Keep moving!" Lena shouted, her voice sharp above the chaos. "The gate's ahead." Isaac nodded, his face pale with exertion but determined. I'll cover the rear. They fought their way to the back gate, each of them gasping for air as they pushed through the crowd of infected. Mark was the first to reach the gate, his crowbar still in hand, ready to bash in the skull of any creature that dared come too close. Lena followed closely, her heart pounding in her chest. They couldn't stop, not now. The hospital was so close, and they had to make it. It was their only chance. Isaac stumbled behind them, his legs giving out from exhaustion. A large infected lunged at him from the side, and for a moment, it seemed like it was over. But before it could reach him, Mark spun around, swinging his crowbar with all his strength. The infected's skull cracked with a sickening sound, and it dropped to the ground, lifeless. Isaac gasped, breathless and trembling, but he didn't stop. He kept moving, as fast as he could, keeping up with Lena and Mark. They reached the back gate, and with one final push, Mark yanked it open. They stumbled through, their bodies aching and their breaths ragged from the fight. But they couldn't stop now. The hospital was just ahead, a dark silhouette in the distance. They still had a chance. Lena turned to Mark, her face set in grim determination. We keep moving. We don't stop until we're inside. Mark nodded, his eyes dark with the same resolve. Let's go. Together, the three of them pushed forward, leaving the chaos behind as they ran toward the hospital that could either save them or end their fight for survival. The final push had begun. The hospital loomed ahead, its skeletal frame casting long shadows across the ground. It was quiet, eerily so. The world around them had descended into chaos, but here, it felt almost still. The entrance, a set of large double doors, was shattered, half of the glass missing, leaving jagged edges like a warning. But they didn't have the luxury of hesitation. Lena, Mark, and Isaac moved in unison, their bodies bruised and bloodied, but driven by the singular need to survive. They'd made it this far, and there was no turning back now. Stay alert, Lena whispered, her voice low but commanding. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but there was no room for fear. If they wanted to live, they had to keep going. Isaac was breathing heavily beside her, his legs shaky from exhaustion, but his eyes were focused. We need to clear the inside. It's too quiet, too easy. Lena nodded. He was right. The infected were cunning now, they had learned, adapted. The quiet could be just another trap. But this hospital was their only hope, and they couldn't afford to second-guess themselves. As they approached the entrance, Mark went first, stepping cautiously over the broken glass. The air smelled stale, tinged with the faint scent of disinfectant and something much worse. The building seemed frozen in time, abandoned in a hurry, with medical charts and forgotten supplies scattered across the floor. The trio entered the darkened hallway, the soft echoes of their footsteps the only sound. The place felt like a tomb, but they pushed forward. The light from their flashlights flickered against the walls, casting strange shadows that seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. Lena took the lead, her knife held at the ready. Her pulse raced, her senses alive to every subtle sound in the emptiness. Something wasn't right. They hadn't seen a single infected yet, which was both a relief and a danger. They reached the main lobby, where the elevators once stood proudly, now nothing more than rusted frames and empty shafts. The walls were cracked, peeling paint revealing the crumbling infrastructure beneath. And yet, it was eerily quiet, too quiet. It didn't feel like a place that had been abandoned for long, but the silence was suffocating. Do you hear that? Mark's voice was barely a whisper. Lena paused, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the building settling. But then, faintly, a sound echoed from deeper within the hospital, the unmistakable shuffle of infected feet. They're here, Lena said, her voice sharp. We need to move. They quickly turned toward the hallway on the left, making their way toward what looked like a stairwell, hoping it would take them to a higher level, maybe even a place to regroup. But as they moved, Lena caught something out of the corner of her eye, a figure in the shadows, standing perfectly still. Isaac stiffened. What is that? Lena held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. Her flashlight caught the figure, standing unnervingly still, its back facing them. She didn't need to see its face to know what it was. It was one of them. The infected had learned to adapt, and now they were using the hospital itself as a trap. It was waiting for them. Without warning, the figure turned, its head snapping unnaturally, eyes bloodshot and wide. The slow, tortured groan that followed sent a chill down her spine. And then, from behind it, more figures emerged, the shuffling of feet growing louder, more numerous. "We're surrounded," Isaac muttered, his voice cracking with fear. Lena's mind raced. They were trapped in the middle of the hospital, no escape routes in sight. She had no idea how many infected were closing in, but it didn't matter. They had to fight their way out, or they wouldn't make it. "Get ready," Lena said, tightening her grip on her knife. Mark pulled out his crowbar, his eyes steely with resolve. "We don't back down." The infected lunged at them, faster than Lena had expected. The first one reached her in an instant, but she was ready, ducking low and driving the knife into its chest, then twisting it violently. The creature dropped, but the next one was already on her. Mark swung his crowbar with precision, knocking an infected back and sending it crashing into a nearby table, but more kept coming. Isaac fought beside them, his face twisted with fear, but his hands steady. Every swing of his pipe counted. But the numbers were overwhelming. The infected seemed to be pouring out of the walls, flooding the hallway, their movements synchronized and terrifyingly efficient. There was no time to think, only to act. Lena stabbed and slashed, her knife moving almost by instinct, cutting through flesh, but every time she took one down, two more appeared to take its place. She had never fought like this before. The raw desperation was unlike anything she had experienced. "Stay close," Lena shouted, slashing through another infected as it lunged at Mark. They were surrounded on all sides now, the stench of decay filling the air, the noise of their struggles drowning out everything else. Isaac's voice was barely audible over the chaos. "We can't keep this up." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. They couldn't hold them off forever. She had to think fast, there was no other way. They needed an exit, and they needed it now. "Look for a way out," Lena shouted. "We need to find a way out, now." She fought her way through the infected, trying to push forward, but they were relentless. A clawed hand grabbed her shoulder, yanking her back. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, fighting back, but the infected was stronger than she anticipated. She twisted, but it was too late. Then, just as she thought she was done for, Isaac tackled the infected from the side, sending it crashing into a pile of debris. He didn't even flinch as he helped Lena back to her feet. "We need to go, now," Isaac yelled, his voice desperate. Lena's eyes flicked around, finding their escape route. She spotted a small utility door in the corner of the room, partially hidden by rubble. It was their only chance. "Over there," Lena shouted. "Move." Mark was already pushing through the crowd, fighting with every ounce of strength. The three of them barreled toward the utility door, hearts pounding, the infected hot on their heels. Isaac slammed into the door, pushing it open just enough for them to squeeze through. The three of them burst into the alley behind the hospital, gasping for breath, their bodies covered in blood and sweat. They had made it. But just barely. For a moment, they stood there, panting and exhausted, staring at the wreckage of the hospital behind them. It hadn't been the sanctuary they'd hoped for, but it had given them the time they needed. The sounds of the infected were distant now, but they wouldn't stop. Not until the last of them was gone. Lena turned to face Mark and Isaac, their faces pale but filled with determination. "We're not done yet," she said. "But we have a chance." A chance. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They didn't know where they'd go next, but one thing was certain, as long as they had each other, they would fight. Together. Until the very end.